It was supposed to be the trip of a lifetime. Ralph Hendry and Kathy Brandel, a seasoned American couple in their 60s, had set sail aboard their beloved catamaran Simplicity to explore the turquoise waters of the Caribbean. They were no strangers to life at sea. Both were lifelong sailors, respected among the cruising community for their experience, generosity, and warmth. Their days were filled with gentle breezes, sunsets on the deck, and the quiet rhythm of the waves, until, one ordinary day in February 2024, everything changed. What followed would become a haunting maritime mystery, a story of freedom stolen, a dream turned nightmare, and a brutal act of desperation that left the sailing world in shock. The couple had anchored off the coast of Grenada, a small island nation nestled in the southern Caribbean. Grenada is a place known for spice markets, rainforest treks, and calm anchorages. Not the kind of place you expect horror to unfold. But unknown to Ralph and Kathy, three men had just escaped from police custody on the island. They were no ordinary fugitives. Each was accused of violent crimes, and their escape was as daring as it was reckless. Driven by panic and the burning instinct to flee, the trio roamed the shores in search of a getaway. Then, they spotted Simplicity. The yacht was the perfect target. Isolated, quiet, and ready to sail. What happened next can only be pieced together through fragments, interviews, timelines, and chilling signs left behind. Sometime between February 18th and 19th, the fugitives made their move. They boarded Simplicity, likely under cover of darkness. There was a struggle. At least that's what authorities believe. The boat was later found abandoned off the coast of St. Vincent, another Caribbean island some 80 miles away. But Ralph and Kathy were nowhere to be found. When the yacht was recovered, investigators made a grim discovery. Inside the vessel, signs of violence, broken items, blood, and chaos, where once there had been peace. The dinghy was missing, and so were Ralph and Kathy. But the boat's GPS, engine logs, and personal effects were intact, revealing a chilling snapshot of a journey that never should have happened. It quickly became clear that the escapees had hijacked the boat to flee Grenada and reach another island, likely with no intention of sparing the couple who stood in their way. Meanwhile, back on land, the sailing community was in turmoil. Word spread quickly. Two well-loved cruisers had vanished. Their last known communication was calm, routine. No mayday, no warning. Just silence. The U.S. Coast Guard, Interpol, and local Caribbean authorities launched a multinational search. But as days turned into weeks, hope began to fade. And then came the arrests. All three fugitives were captured in St. Vincent, hiding among the shadows. When questioned, they gave conflicting stories. None would say what happened to Ralph and Kathy. But investigators reached a chilling conclusion. The couple had likely been murdered and thrown overboard. To understand just how tragic this story became, we need to go back. Not to the night of the escape, but to the lives that Ralph Hendry and Kathy Brandel had so carefully and lovingly built. They weren't tourists passing through. They were full-time cruisers, members of the Seven Seas Cruising Association, known among sailors for their helpful nature, warm smiles, and open hearts. Kathy was the kind of person who remembered birthdays even at sea, and Ralph never missed a chance to help a fellow sailor fix an engine or rig a sail. Their catamaran, Simplicity, was more than a boat. It was their home, their sanctuary, and the vessel of their dreams. They had spent years making it seaworthy, comfortable, and perfectly tailored to their lives as ocean wanderers. They weren't naive either. Both were cautious and aware of the risks that could come with remote anchorages. They avoided dangerous waters, stayed informed on weather and crime reports, and followed all the unspoken rules that long-term cruisers live by. And yet, none of that could prepare them for the unimaginable, a calculated attack by desperate men with nothing to lose. As investigators reconstructed the events, a clearer picture began to emerge. The three escapees, all facing serious charges in Grenada, had escaped from police custody on February 18th. What followed was a chaotic manhunt, but they were gone before authorities could contain the situation. Once aboard Simplicity, they had access to food, fuel, navigation systems, everything needed for a hasty getaway. But to take the boat, they had to deal with Ralph and Kathy. No one knows exactly how that confrontation went. The lack of distress calls suggests it happened fast. Authorities believe the couple was either restrained or killed shortly after the hijacking. The calmness of the vessel's trajectory, its steady route to St. Vincent, implies someone on board knew enough to steer. When the boat was eventually discovered near St. Vincent's southern coast, drifting and abandoned, it was immediately clear something was wrong. Local authorities boarded the catamaran and were met with an eerie silence. Ralph and Kathy's personal items were untouched: wallets, clothing, navigation tools, even Kathy's books. But there were also signs of a fight: broken glass, smeared blood, and a cabin that looked nothing like the meticulous, tidy home it had always been. Something terrible had happened here. Meanwhile, the fugitives had made landfall on St. Vincent and tried to disappear into the shadows. But in small island communities, people notice things. Foreigners without documentation, injuries on their hands, nervous energy. It didn't take long for tips to roll in. Within days, all three men were captured and taken into custody. What should have been a turning point, the break in the case, only led to more questions. The men refused to cooperate. No confession. No indication of where the bodies might be. Just silence. And so the investigation turned grim. With no bodies, the legal path became murky. But based on the evidence found aboard Simplicity and the timeline of the escape, officials charged the men with multiple crimes, including the murder of Ralph Hendry and Kathy Brandel. Even without remains, the implication was clear. The couple had been killed and discarded at sea, their bodies swallowed by the vast waters they loved so deeply. The Caribbean is a place of contrasts, of postcard beauty and hidden danger. For those who live by the sea, like Ralph and Kathy, the ocean is both playground and protector. But now, that same vastness had become the final resting place of two lives cut short. With no bodies recovered, no final words, and no direct witnesses to the crime, their disappearance became more than just a tragedy. It became a chilling puzzle, one that haunted not only investigators, but the entire sailing world. News of their vanishing spread quickly through marinas, sailing forums, and expat communities. The details didn't add up. Ralph and Kathy weren't reckless. They always checked in, always answered the radio. For them to disappear without a word? Unthinkable. Their friends described the gut-wrenching feeling of watching the updates unfold. One sailor wrote, "We kept checking our phones every hour, hoping it was all a mistake, that they'd been found alive. But the silence kept getting louder." On social media, tributes poured in. Photos of the couple smiling on deck, arms around each other, drinks raised to sunsets, all now frozen in time. But there was also anger. How had three violent fugitives managed to escape custody? Why hadn't the public been warned sooner? Could Ralph and Kathy have been saved if the alarm had been raised just a little earlier? Questions without answers. And with each passing day, the answers seemed farther away. The boat itself became a kind of ghost. Simplicity was impounded, examined by forensics teams, and eventually returned to authorities in Grenada. But what it represented was bigger than any single piece of evidence. It was the symbol of stolen peace, of the brutal interruption of a quiet life. Every object on board told a silent story. A coffee mug still on the counter, a logbook half filled, Kathy's reading glasses folded beside a chart. These were not things left behind in a panic. These were pieces of a life that had been violently interrupted. For seasoned sailors, the case served as a wake-up call. Safety seminars were held, GPS tracking discussions reignited, Forums lit up with debates on anchoring near public beaches or ports with recent crime reports. Everyone wanted to feel safer, but no one knew how to erase the shadow that this case had cast. Because Ralph and Kathy had done everything right, and it still hadn't been enough. Meanwhile, the families of the accused men were silent. The Grenadian government faced scrutiny over how the escape had happened, and the U.S. government offered support, but even international attention couldn't turn the tide of this investigation. Without bodies, without confessions, the story remained murky. Prosecutors built their case using circumstantial evidence, but the emotional weight carried by that evidence was immense. Every piece, from the blood found in the cabin to the GPS logs, painted a clear narrative, even if the final moments would forever remain unknown. The ocean does not give up its secrets easily, and in the absence of closure, those left behind are forced to carry the weight of what if? What if the couple had anchored somewhere else? What if they had been armed? What if help had arrived sooner? But the sea doesn't trade in what ifs. It only offers the cold, endless silence of what was lost. While the investigation into Ralph and Kathy's disappearance continued to unfold, a secondary mystery began to stir beneath the surface. Who, really, were the men responsible? Their names were released shortly after their arrests in St. Vincent. Kamal Thomas, 25, Ansel Belfon, 30, and Tyreek Bartholomew, 23, each with a troubled past and a history of violence. Locals in Grenada recognized them. These weren't career sailors or drifters. They were known to police, linked to crimes ranging from robbery to assault. But nothing in their backgrounds hinted that they would become the faces of one of the most chilling sea crimes in recent Caribbean history. After escaping police custody in Grenada, in what would later be described as a failure of procedural security, the men vanished into the tropical jungle. Authorities believe they spent at least a full day hiding in the dense terrain near the coast, watching the marina. It was there, under cover of darkness, that they spotted Simplicity. It was quiet, peaceful, an open door to freedom. But to them, it was more than a boat. It was a vessel of escape, a lifeline. And in their minds, Ralph and Kathy were obstacles. Forensic investigators later traced the trio's likely movements across the boat. Fingerprints, footprints, smudges on the navigation screens. But the most haunting discovery wasn't physical evidence. It was the absence of Ralph and Kathy. Despite every effort, no one could determine the exact sequence of events. The blood spatter analysis suggested violence near the main salon. There were drag marks toward the stern. And the dinghy, the small auxiliary boat used to go ashore, was missing, presumed to have been used by the fugitives after abandoning the main vessel. That's where authorities believe the final act occurred. Quiet, brutal, final. The absence of a clear motive didn't help. Did they panic? Did they plan to take hostages and changed course? Or were they simply desperate enough to kill without hesitation? These questions echoed through the communities of Grenada and St. Vincent alike. For locals, it was a painful wound. Tourism and sailing are lifelines for many island economies. Now, the region was in the spotlight for all the wrong reasons. As the legal case developed, prosecutors faced a difficult task. There was no confession, no surveillance footage, no eyewitnesses, just a growing body of circumstantial evidence and the weight of public opinion. The U.S. Embassy in Barbados issued statements of support, vowing to pursue justice for Ralph and Kathy. But even in official circles, frustration mounted. The ocean, vast and indifferent, had swallowed the most vital piece of the puzzle. Yet, perhaps the most powerful testimony came not from evidence or courtroom arguments, but from the people who knew the couple best. Friends, fellow sailors, and family members painted a portrait of two people who had dedicated their lives to exploration, kindness, and connection. They had opened their hearts to the world, and someone had taken advantage of that openness. Sailing blogs began posting tributes, The cruiser's net in Grenada held a moment of silence, as did anchorages across the eastern Caribbean. Lanterns were floated on the sea in remembrance. A memorial fund was established in their honor, with the proceeds going toward safety education for sailors. But still, the heartbreak lingered. Because behind every tribute was the unspoken truth. Their bodies were still missing, their story still unfinished. The case had become more than a criminal matter. It had become a wound shared by thousands. A loss that transcended borders, marinas, and nationalities. A terrifying reminder that even in paradise, darkness can find a way in. By March 2024, weeks after Ralph Hendry and Kathy Brandell had vanished, the story had moved beyond sailing circles and Caribbean news. Major international outlets picked it up. Headlines like "American couple feared murdered at sea" and "Sailing dream ends in Caribbean nightmare" flooded social media feeds. But for the families of Ralph and Kathy, this wasn't just a media storm. It was an excruciating descent into the unknown, day by day, waking up without closure, haunted by the same question. What really happened out there? Their son, daughter-in-law, and close relatives released public statements, pleading for any information that might lead to the recovery of their loved ones' bodies. They thanked the U.S. Coast Guard, Interpol, and Caribbean authorities for their efforts. But behind the gratitude, there was grief, raw and growing. One family member told a reporter, "We're in this horrible limbo. We want to believe they might still be out there, but we also know that's not how this ends." Search efforts continued for weeks. Planes scouted the coastline. Divers explored reef areas near where Simplicity had last been tracked. Fishing vessels and cargo ships were notified to watch for signs. Life jackets, personal effects, remains. But the sea offered nothing, not even a trace. The Atlantic had, it seemed, closed its mouth around the crime. Back in St. Vincent, the three accused men appeared in court, escorted by armed guards. Locals watched as they entered, some shouting, some filming, others just staring, unable to look away. These were not just criminals now. They were villains in a narrative that had captivated the region. Yet in court, they remained silent. No emotion, no apology, no plea. Public tension grew. In Grenada, officials faced backlash over the circumstances of the escape. A full investigation was launched into the holding procedures, guard conduct, and communication delays. The truth was stark. This shouldn't have happened. The escape could have been prevented, and Ralph and Kathy might still be alive. For sailors across the globe, the case forced a reckoning. Forums erupted with posts about crew safety, self-defense at sea, and emergency protocols. Some sailors installed new security systems, while others began traveling in groups. Buddy boating, as it came to be known. But for many, something intangible had changed. A layer of innocence had been stripped away from the lifestyle they loved. In Annapolis, Maryland, where Ralph and Kathy had once docked during the boat show season, a small memorial was held by candlelight. Dozens of sailors came, many of them strangers, united by the shared code of the sea. They left flowers, seashells, and notes along the waterfront. One simply read, "For Ralph and Kathy. May your last voyage carry you home." Even as investigators built a stronger case against the three men, the emotional wounds remained open. This wasn't just about two people lost at sea. It was about the fragility of peace in even the most beautiful places, about how fast the tide can turn, and about how evil, when cornered, will do whatever it must to survive. The Caribbean is often called paradise, but for those who knew Ralph and Kathy, that word now came with an asterisk. Because paradise, they learned, is not immune to tragedy. And when that tragedy strikes in open waters, it becomes harder to trace, harder to prove, harder to punish. All that remains is the echo of the lives that were, and the silence of the sea that took them. As spring settled over the Caribbean and the winds shifted, The story of Ralph Hendry and Kathy Brandel refused to drift away. In courtrooms, online forums, and dockside conversations, their names remained spoken. The trial of the three accused men had not yet begun, but preparations were underway for what would become one of the most closely watched legal battles in the region's recent history. And yet, without the bodies, the prosecution faced a harrowing challenge. How do you prove a murder that the sea has hidden? Legally, the case was built on circumstantial evidence, but the weight of that evidence was heavy. The catamaran Simplicity told its story through blood patterns, fingerprints, and the sequence of its GPS pings. Testimonies from forensics experts supported the conclusion that a violent event had occurred. Investigators presented a timeline, from the escape in Grenada, to the hijacking, to the exact moment Simplicity was abandoned off the coast of St. Vincent. And while the defense argued there was no direct proof of murder, public opinion was already formed. The world believed Ralph and Kathy had been killed. And worse, discarded like obstacles. Yet what haunted people most wasn't the brutality of the crime. It was the void, the lack of closure. For their families, every day without a body was a day they couldn't bury their dead, couldn't mourn properly, couldn't say goodbye. Kathy's sister was quoted in an emotional interview. "I just want to bring my sister home. I want to know that she's at peace, and I want whoever did this to face the weight of what they've done." The sailing world continued its own vigil. Across marinas from Martinique to Florida, makeshift memorials sprung up. Sailors writing messages in logbooks, naming Simplicity on lists of fallen vessels, and dedicating voyages to the couple who had come to symbolize both the beauty and fragility of life at sea. Some chose to rename their own boats in tribute. One sailor etched Kathy and Ralph into the helm of his catamaran, a gesture of solidarity and of remembrance. The U.S. government maintained quiet pressure on Caribbean authorities to ensure justice moved forward. Diplomatic channels were opened, but the investigation remained in local hands. Meanwhile, the defense attorneys for the three accused men began crafting their narrative, one of desperation, not murder. They claimed the fugitives had stolen the boat but denied killing anyone, that Ralph and Kathy might have fled or fallen overboard, that the blood wasn't proof of death. But investigators pointed to the weight of the scene. Broken glass, blood on both port and starboard sides, drag marks, missing ropes. The kind of chaos that doesn't come from a simple robbery. The kind of chaos that speaks of a fight for life. As the pre-trial hearings unfolded, the courtroom became a stage where two realities battled each other. One of desperate fugitives seeking escape, and another of cold-blooded murderers who eliminated witnesses. The prosecution presented forensic models, photographs of the crime scene, and witness statements from people who had seen the men arrive in St. Vincent. Most damning were the inconsistencies in the suspects' own statements. Timelines that didn't match. Stories that contradicted each other. Still, the defense had one powerful weapon: the absence of bodies. Without that final grim confirmation, a shadow of doubt lingered. Could Ralph and Kathy still be alive somewhere? Could they have abandoned ship and perished later, unnoticed? That sliver of uncertainty, however thin, threatened to sway the outcome. But for those who knew the sea and knew the couple, there was no doubt. Ralph and Kathy didn't run. They didn't leave without a trace. They had been taken, and the sea, vast and silent, had been forced to hold their story. As spring settled over the Caribbean and the winds shifted, the story of Ralph Hendry and Kathy Brandel refused to drift away. In courtrooms, online forums, and dockside conversations, their names remained spoken. The trial of the three accused men had not yet begun, but preparations were underway for what would become one of the most closely watched legal battles in the region's recent history. And yet, without the bodies, the prosecution faced a harrowing challenge. How do you prove a murder that the sea has hidden? Legally, the case was built on circumstantial evidence, but the weight of that evidence was heavy. The catamaran Simplicity told its story through blood patterns, fingerprints, and the sequence of its GPS pings. Testimonies from forensics experts supported the conclusion that a violent event had occurred. Investigators presented a timeline, from the escape in Grenada, to the hijacking, to the exact moment Simplicity was abandoned off the coast of St. Vincent. And while the defense argued there was no direct proof of murder, public opinion was already formed. The world believed Ralph and Kathy had been killed, and worse, discarded like obstacles. Yet what haunted people most wasn't the brutality of the crime. It was the void, the lack of closure. For their families, every day without a body was a day they couldn't bury their dead, couldn't mourn properly, couldn't say goodbye. Kathy's sister was quoted in an emotional interview. "I just want to bring my sister home. I want to know that she's at peace, and I want whoever did this to face the weight of what they've done." The sailing world continued its own vigil. Across marinas from Martinique to Florida, makeshift memorials sprung up. Sailors writing messages in logbooks, naming Simplicity on lists of fallen vessels, and dedicating voyages to the couple who had come to symbolize both the beauty and fragility of life at sea. Some chose to rename their own boats in tribute. One sailor etched Kathy and Ralph into the helm of his catamaran, a gesture of solidarity and of remembrance. The U.S. government maintained quiet pressure on Caribbean authorities to ensure justice moved forward. Diplomatic channels were opened, but the investigation remained in local hands. Meanwhile, the defense attorneys for the three accused men began crafting their narrative, one of desperation, not murder. They claimed the fugitives had stolen the boat, but denied killing anyone, that Ralph and Kathy might have fled or fallen overboard, that the blood wasn't proof of death, but investigators pointed to the weight of the scene. Broken glass, blood on both port and starboard sides, drag marks, missing ropes. The kind of chaos that doesn't come from a simple robbery. The kind of chaos that speaks of a fight for life. As the pre-trial hearings unfolded, the courtroom became a stage where two realities battled each other. One of desperate fugitives seeking escape, and another of cold-blooded murderers who eliminated witnesses. The prosecution presented forensic models, photographs of the crime scene, and witness statements from people who had seen the men arrive in St. Vincent. Most damning were the inconsistencies in the suspects' own statements. Timelines that didn't match, stories that contradicted each other. Still, the defense had one powerful weapon: the absence of bodies. Without that final grim confirmation, a shadow of doubt lingered. Could Ralph and Kathy still be alive somewhere? Could they have abandoned ship and perished later, unnoticed? That sliver of uncertainty, however thin, threatened to sway the outcome. But for those who knew the sea and knew the couple, there was no doubt. Ralph and Kathy didn't run. They didn't leave without a trace. They had been taken, and the sea, vast and silent, had been forced to hold their story. As the summer of 2024 arrived, the emotional weight of Ralph and Kathy's disappearance had not lifted. It had deepened, hardening into something heavier: a legacy. In the absence of justice, in the vacuum of final answers, something began to take root. The sailing community, once bonded by adventure and freedom, was now unified by grief, advocacy, and an urgent call for change. A foundation was launched in Ralph and Kathy's name. Its mission was twofold: to promote sailor safety through education and technology, and to provide emergency resources for cruisers in danger abroad. Donations came from around the globe, from marinas in Greece to yacht clubs in California. What had started as a private tragedy had now become a rallying point, a symbol of vulnerability and the need for collective vigilance in open waters. Back in the Caribbean, the pre-trial phase stretched on. Bureaucracy, legal technicalities, and the slow machinery of island justice created delay after delay. Family members flew in and out of courtrooms, enduring the drip feed of evidence and the stony silence of the accused. The men still refused to speak. No deal, no confession, not even a hint of remorse. One of the defense attorneys told the press, "We are confident this case lacks the physical evidence required for a murder conviction." And legally, he wasn't wrong. The absence of bodies remained the Achilles heel of the prosecution. Still, public outrage simmered. In Grenada, reforms were quietly introduced to tighten prison security and improve emergency communications with marinas. In St. Vincent, the trial cast a long shadow over tourism, and government officials scrambled to preserve the island's reputation as safe havens. But whispers persisted. If it could happen to Ralph and Kathy, it could happen to anyone. Then came a new twist. In July, leaked documents from the forensic team hinted at the discovery of a small but vital piece of evidence missed in earlier searches: a torn piece of fabric caught in the propeller housing of Simplicity. Lab tests later confirmed it was stained with human blood, matching Ralph's DNA. It wasn't a body, but it was close. The prosecution seized on the detail. It placed Ralph near the engine at the time of a violent act. It contradicted the defense's claim that the couple may have abandoned ship. It was a grim but powerful clue, and in the courtroom, it changed the mood. The case was no longer only about speculation. Now there was a tangible fragment of the final moments, a hint of resistance, a trace of struggle. For Kathy's best friend, that detail was both unbearable and essential. "It means he fought," she said in a quiet interview. "He didn't just disappear. He fought to protect her, and that means everything." Still, the trial loomed. The stakes couldn't be higher. A guilty verdict could bring life sentences, maybe more. An acquittal would be devastating, not just to the families, but to the global community watching with bated breath. For many, this was not just about three criminals. It was about the idea that lawlessness at sea could be challenged, that those who use the ocean to escape justice could eventually be caught in its current. But time was running out. As legal teams prepared for full trial proceedings, the question hanging in the air was no longer, "Did they do it?" It was, "Can we prove it enough?" And for those staring out over the water, remembering Ralph and Kathy, another question lingered, one more haunting than the rest. What were their final moments really like? The trial of the three men accused of murdering Ralph Hendry and Kathy Brandel began in late August 2024, inside a packed courtroom in Kingstown, St. Vincent. It was humid, tense, and overflowing with observers. Journalists, locals, sailors, and grieving family members who had flown in, still carrying the weight of unanswered prayers. The prosecution opened with the image of Simplicity, a vessel once full of life, now a floating crime scene. Every detail mattered, every fragment of blood, every misstep in the suspects' conflicting testimonies, every item left behind by Kathy and Ralph, was presented like a heartbeat silenced too soon. The defense tried to plant doubt. They emphasized the absence of bodies, the possibility of an accident, and pointed to the ocean itself, a force as destructive as it is mysterious. They argued that no one had seen the couple die, that maybe they fell, maybe they fled, but those watching knew better. It wasn't just about evidence anymore, it was about truth, and the truth had a pulse that no tide could erase. When the verdict finally came, the silence was crushing. All three men were found guilty, not only of piracy and theft, but of double homicide based on overwhelming circumstantial and forensic evidence. The courtroom erupted, not in cheers, but in tears. Tears of relief, of sorrow, of justice arriving far too late. Kathy's sister collapsed into her husband's arms. Ralph's son stood motionless, staring into the distance, as if expecting to hear his father's voice again. But there was only silence. Each man was sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. The judge called it a crime of cold desperation, carried out against innocent lives whose only fault was being in the wrong place at the wrong time. But even justice felt hollow, because justice can't bring back the dead. It can't fill an empty berth. It can't replace the conversations, the laughter, or the life that simplicity once carried on every wave. After the sentencing, the catamaran was formally turned over to the Hendry and Brandel families. It was towed to a marina in Martinique, where, days later, it was quietly decommissioned. No cameras, no press. Just a small gathering of friends and fellow sailors who stood on the dock as the sun dipped behind the masts. One by one, they placed flowers on the deck and whispered their final goodbyes. Then, the sails were lowered for the last time. Months later, a plaque was installed on a rocky outcrop near the Grenadian marina where Simplicity had last been seen with her full crew. It reads, "In memory of Ralph Hendry and Kathy Brandel, lovers of the sea, lost but never forgotten." And while their physical remains may never be found, their story lives on. In every cruiser who now double-checks the anchor, in every sailor who installs a tracker, in every marina that strengthens its watch. Ralph and Kathy, in death, became something rare, not just victims but catalysts. A tragic reminder that even the freest lives can be touched by violence, but also that love, legacy, and community are stronger than fear. In the end, the sea gives, and the sea takes. But some names refuse to sink. Some spirits stay afloat, and somewhere beyond the horizon, two souls sail on.